Hi, I'm Andy Jones, content editor for Plaid's online education program, Let's Paint. Today, I'm going to show you how to use the liner brush. Are you ready? Let's get started. Today, I'm going to give you tips and hints for doing line work. Line work seems to be the one thing that throws most people off. They want to paint a fine line and they just don't know how to do it. So I'm going to show you all I know about using a liner brush. My preference for a liner brush is a script liner, which has much longer bristles than a regular liner brush. It holds more paint, but it all comes to the same fine point. So it doesn't matter if you have a 0 liner, a 1 liner, or a 2 liner, all good liner brushes come to the same size point. You want to make sure that your liner brush snaps back to a point. So if you were to dip your brush in water and get it wet, you should be able to sling it like a thermometer and the brush should snap back to a razor sharp point. That's the sign of a good paintbrush. All right, so I'm going to use some blue paint today. I'm using regular folk art acrylic paint, and folk art paint is nice and creamy and thick, which is great for general painting applications, but the worst thing you could have for line work. We need to make our paint very, very thin. So I'm adding some water to my paint and I'm mixing it in with a palette knife. You want to make sure to mix all of the water into the paint thoroughly, and you don't have to spread the paint out all over the palette. You can keep it pushed into a nice puddle, and I'm going to add a little bit more water because like I said, I want this paint to be really thin. Years ago, we used to tell people that you wanted your paint an ink-like consistency, but nobody uses a fountain pen and nobody knows what ink is like anymore. So what I like to tell people, it's got to be thin like spilled milk. So when you finish using your palette knife, you want to make sure to wipe it off between paper towels and wipe the edges. Never lay your palette knife down dirty. If you always clean your palette knife, it'll always be ready when you pick it up to use it the next time. So I'm going to take my liner brush, dip it into water, and I'm going to come to the puddle of paint and I'm going to begin to thin this paint down even a little bit more. I want it to feel very, very loose and watery, but still have just a little bit of body to it. And for this, you can twirl the brush to a point. Then, the important thing to remember is I've put my brush in water. You always want to blot the brush just where the ferrule meets the brush hair. That way, if there's any moisture on your ferrule, when you turn your brush ready to paint, that little bit of water is not going to race down the bristles and blot out onto your painting. It's very disappointing when that happens. So I'm going to show you how to make fine lines. Two things you have to remember. You have to hold your brush with the handle up toward the ceiling, perpendicular to your painting surface, and you have to use virtually no pressure. So just make contact with the surface and you can make a very, very fine line. Again, touch the brush to the surface, apply no pressure, and pull. If you apply pressure, you can get a thick line, which is not what you want. So practice until you can touch the brush just to the surface and then pull. And you notice I'm not having to pick up any more paint, and that's because my paint is the right consistency. It's super, super thin, has just a little body in it, and I've loaded my brush very full of paint. The script liner allows you to hold a tremendous amount of paint in the brush, and you can make lots of little fine lines. You can make a series of parallel lines and then come back and make perpendicular lines. This is called cross-hatching. So there are lots of things if you need to paint little tiny veins in a flower petal, you can do that. But one of the nicer things you can do, again, touch your brush to the water, come to the edge of the paint puddle, load your brush full of paint, blot where the ferrule and the bristles come together, and you can paint little tendrils or vines, like a series of M's and W's with your brush. And as long as you move slowly, your brush will have time to come around and make gentle little loops. So the important thing is to have your brush full of paint that's nice and thin in consistency. If your paint is too thick, you'll never ever paint a thin line. If your brush isn't of good quality and come to a nice point, you'll never paint a good line. So practice holding your brush perpendicular to the surface and having very little pressure on the brush, and you can paint very thin lines every time.